This week we had a BlackRock filed an application for an ETH ETF. Now, we've been saying for a while that once a Bitcoin spot ETF is approved, it won't be long before we get an ETH spot ETF. And now BlackRock, who started this whole mess earlier in the year when they finally filed an application for a Bitcoin spot ETF, is filing for ETH. And it's likely that the other players will probably jump in and do the same thing. They'll just copy paste just like they do the BlackRock Bitcoin spot ETF. So there will likely be more players that jump into this. We know Grayscale has already filed to move their Ethereum trust to an ETH spot ETF. And it will be really hard, I think, for the SEC once Bitcoin gets approved to not approve others. So what does this mean? Now, obviously, an ETH spot ETF would cause institutional demand. If and when it gets approved, there will be likely, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars that flow into this, just like will flow into Bitcoin. What is interesting to note here, though, is that the issuance policy for ETH, the token, is different than the issuance policy for Bitcoin. Of course, with Bitcoin, the ETF will so directly affect the demand and therefore affect the price because Bitcoin has a fixed supply. 21 million is the fixed supply of Bitcoin. We know how many there are. We know how many haven't moved in over a year. We know when they were created, and we know what the issuance policy, and next year we'll start the halving or the halvening in April when the new issue of Bitcoin will be cut in half every 10 minutes, or every year we'll basically be creating half as much Bitcoin as we're doing right now. With ETH, it's different. With ETH, every block or every 12 to 15 seconds, there is more ETH that is created and given as a reward to the validators. But with every block, there is also some ETH that is burned. And the amount of ETH that is created is sometimes greater than the amount of ETH that's burned, and sometimes less than the amount of ETH that is burned, and it is dependent on the number of transactions in that particular block. And so at some points ETH is inflationary, and some points it's deflationary. So it doesn't have the same monetary policy as Bitcoin. So we can't necessarily draw a direct correlation and say if X amount of dollars goes into an ETH ETF, it will materially affect the price. Yes, the ETF issuers have to buy and hold that much ETH, but we don't have a set number on how much ETH will ever be created. That's not necessarily part of the monetary policy. It's not necessarily part of the value prop of having a set amount of ETH. The value prop of ETH is somewhat based on demand for ETH because it's used to actually pay for transactions on the Ethereum blockchain. So issuance policy, the monetary policy is not the same. So the ETH ETF isn't necessarily going to have that same type of effect, but it will have a huge effect. You will have institutions able to invest through an ETH spot ETF. Same as Bitcoin, you will have people with IRAs, 401ks, retirement plans able to get in. And just like Bitcoin, it would symbolize an opening up of the US government and the regulators to Ethereum and to ETH, the native token of the Ethereum network. So it will have kind of similar effects, but as financial advisors, we have to understand what it actually means and understand that there's a different issuance policy. Ethereum is different than Bitcoin. It has a different purpose, and therefore the value of the ETH token is very different from the value of the Bitcoin token. The fundamental valuation is different for ETH than it is for Bitcoin. And therefore, there will be different reasons why people might want to hold the ETH ETF. It's not necessarily just number go up. They have to have an investment thesis behind it. And therefore, having the ETH ETF and having whatever demand comes with that, yes, it will likely positively affect the price, but there's a different thesis and theory as to why it will positively affect the price. Why ETH should have value at all, or what value it should have, is different. The investment thesis is different than it is for Bitcoin. And it's important for us as financial advisors to understand the difference such that we can explain to our clients why they might want to be in one or the other or both, and just to explain why it's okay to be in both and why one has value or the other has value.